I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Jayson Maurice Porter, Black Environmental History of Sesame. Jayson is an environmental writer and historian. He is assistant professor of the history department at the University of Maryland, and this is effective as of last Thursday. So let's all give a yay. And that is a tenure track position as well. So we're really happy to see that. He is on the Black and Indigenous Climate faculty in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So that's at the University of Maryland. He specializes in Black and Indigenous environmental histories, agriculture and food systems, agrochemicals, cultural histories of ecology and botany, which is, as you know, very close to our hearts here at the Lloyd Library, and environmental histories of revolution, resistance, and land reform. He is an editorial board member of the North American Congress for Latin America and Plant Perspectives, an Interdisciplinary Journal. Outside of academia, he loves to connect with other Black environmental educators, write creative nonfiction stories, which, Jayson, that's my favorite genre, by the way, and design environmental literacy curricula for broader audiences of all ages. Please join me in welcoming Jayson Maurice Porter.
I changed the title ever so slightly because I intentionally published an essay called Sesame Plots last week, or on the 17th. So I'm gonna do a short reading of that to end this. But I'm gonna try to keep it brief. I'm starting a little late, it's about 2:15 and I have until 3. I'm gonna make sure we have as much time for Dr. Carney to come up after. So I'm gonna probably try to end at least 10 minutes early for questions if you have them. So I'll try to keep it a little bit short. So I had planned to read about maybe a third of it, but I might take that a little bit down. So roadmap of like where we're going. And just to start, these are pictures that were sent to me from a sesame farmer in Ghana, who I have been working with and sharing some of their stories of their family farm and their project. This is also from that family farm in Ghana. So where are we going? I'm gonna start a little bit with just some details about myself so you can see my positionality and where I'm coming from. Then I'm gonna shift to talking about plants as sites of proxies and historical methods. It's so lovely that we just finished thinking about plants as sites of healing. So I'm gonna kind of build off of that similar type of discourse and conversation. Then I'm gonna shift to what are oil seeds like sesame and what do they remember? And then I'm going to zoom into a case study that really focuses on like my particular dissertation research and book projects on sesame histories and oilseed histories in the state of Guerrero, Mexico, as an archive or method of studying the Black population in southern Mexico. And then I'm going to end with a reading of a creative nonfiction piece I published last week called Sesame Plots. I'll read about a third of it for you guys. Okay, so where am I coming from? I'm a Baltimore-born Philadelphian who's lived in Tucson, Arizona, and Jackson, Mississippi from the ages of 10 to 23. I come from a proud family of farmers and civil rights activists from Maryland and Pennsylvania. As a college student in Mississippi, I was a philosophy and environmental science major who helped museums and nonprofits design spaces for community art, food justice, youth-centered environmental literacy. I also helped run a food distribution warehouse in Jackson, Mississippi for years. Actually won international Hunger Relief Award. Now I'm first and foremost an environmental historian of the state of Guerrero, Mexico, which I think is one of the most politically important regions in the African diaspora in the Americas. It is actually named after Vicente Guerrero, who was the first Afro-Indigenous president in the history of the Americas. As mentioned, beyond my academic roles, I am editorial board member since 2021 of the North American Congress on Latin America, NACLA, which is the oldest political magazine on Latin America in the United States. And I, as an environmental justice practitioner, I'm the board chair of an environmental justice policymaking organization called One Square World that works with grassroots organizations and states to help facilitate environmental justice design. I also now, as of a couple months ago, I'm the groundskeeper and curator of the Cedar Gallery at the University of Maryland's Indigenous Futures Lab, and Cedar stands for Centering Ecologies, Diasporas, and Ancestral Roots. We're having our first event on April 30th. a Black ecology, Black and Indigenous ecologies panel. And then I also help various institutions like the City of Chicago's Teachers Union develop freedom justice schools around environmental justice, as well as Rutgers University. I helped them do Black ecologies field labs throughout the South to connect climate justice activists from New Orleans to Virginia to Maryland to North Carolina. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into plants as archives and sites of proxies and methods. So what is a plant archive? A plant archive is a species or specimen that shares historical information through a proxy or methodological analysis. It is a site of proxies and methods that help us decipher the possibilities of how our land is going to change. Some examples of this are tree rings, pollen, lake bed cores, coral, and I would argue plantation crops, palms, and other oil seeds. Now, what is a proxy? They are physical, geochemical, biological, and geological measurements that provide historical data from a natural archive. Examples include bacterial lipids captured in lake bed cores. So to just give an example, so if a tree ring is an archive, right, then the particular, so a tree ring demarcates a wintering period, right, where the vascular cambium or growth tissue of a tree stops, right? So isolating a particular metric to tell like what is happening when, that becomes the proxy. So the proxy is usually a mathematical formula. So I'm going to say, as a historian, I don't really dabble in proxies. I dabble more in methods. So what is a plant archival method? These are systematic, or speculative approaches that follow plants in historical archives to triangulate, isolate data, patterns, and narratives. I'm going to show you some of those examples today in my own research as well as in other research. Some great examples of this type of work that I really admire are Claudia Liao's Landscapes of Freedom, Case Watkins' Palm Oil Diaspora, and Jory Lewis's Slaves for Peanuts, where they use different plants, in all cases oilseed crops, to help show and track Black experiences in the diaspora, from Senegal to Brazil to Colombia. So what are plant archives and methods when it comes to justice? Archives and proxies that provide historical climatic data on regions experiencing climate crisis most immediately, the tropics and the subtropics. Consider tree rings. I mentioned tree rings are demarcation of a what? A winter. So if you don't have a winter, you don't have a tree ring in the same way. So if you take that into consideration, a tree ring doesn't not help us understand climate change in places that don't have winters. So if you slice a tree in Jamaica or in Colombia or in Senegal, you're not going to see tree rings in the same way. Yet it's a narrative that becomes so normative that we just think that's how trees grow. And that in its very self erases our ability to understand climate change in these places experiencing it most drastically. So when I talk about proxies and methods of justice, I'm thinking about what type of plants can we isolate? What kind of plants can we study, mark patterns that can help us understand places that don't have winters? You know, another important kind of climactic archive that we have is Arctic tree ring, or Arctic cores, right? Again, another place that if you don't have glaciers, if you don't have ice cores, you don't have a way to use that to understand climate change in the tropics where they're experiencing the most. That make sense? Cool. I see the heads, y'all good. Okay, so this is where I get to oil seeds, right? So how might oil seeds serve as another plant variety that holds histories of the tropics and the subtropics? Following? Awesome. All right, so what is an oil seed? So that's kind of like it's kind of a misnomer because like all seeds have oils. So this term oil seed or oleaginous crop is a socioeconomic term, not a botanical one or a biological one. I'll be really clear. You know, I'm the historian. I do the kind of the social history, the economic history. I'm not going to break down and say this is biological. It's not. It's really an economic term. So if you look at a lot of developing, particularly in the early 20th century, a lot of countries in the tropics that were trying to bolster their economies, they tried to transition from agricultural to industrial through these oilseed crops. Because through the excess amount of oils that they produce, they could produce things like soaps and vegetable oils and processed goods and things for industry. So it was a track towards industrialization, something that we see now in the biofuel industry, literally. So if you look at the history of the late 19th century, early 20th century, oilseeds were some of that major materia prima for the first kind of biofuel kind of swath. So most seeds produce oils, as I said, but socioeconomic oil seeds produce enough oils to make them profitable to these industries that I mentioned. And these have been kind of the bedrock of many of the Black environmentalist stories that I fancy the most. And in these pictures, you see Jory Lewis's Slave Per Peanuts, which won a James Beard Award. She's incredible. She tore up the first version of the Sesame plots that I'm going to read to you today. She did not like it at all. So I had to do massive revisions. But these are also some other examples of oilseed crops. So this is in the state that I studied. This is in Guerrero. This is taken in a town called Cuajinicolapa in the coast. And this is of Afro-Mexican. They're moving sesame, ajonjolí. This is coconut, oilseed crop, and this is cacao. All three of those are very important in the region I'll be talking to you about today. So from tree rings to oilseed methods. So as I said, a tree ring is an artifact of wintering and a marker of a tree's relationship to climate, topography, and geography, which is just, again, it's just so ironic that we don't necessarily associate tree rings with climate and geography when we use them to study climate and geography. They tell us when a tree goes to sleep during the summer. However, tree ring-based archives are not evenly distributed around the world, like I said. So how might these oil seeds right here, this is palm oil, help kind of make this better? So I just wanted to take a second just to kind of think a little bit about material witness and some of the forms of science and history out there that have really inspired me. Activism as well. Some noteworthy examples that I think are really powerful. And this idea of what stories the landscape hold on to come from a landscape architect and historian, Taiso Way, who works at Dumbarton Oaks, a place that is very much in conversation in the same vein as the Lloyd Museum here today. So the Community Remembrance Project, which is part of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, is actively going and collecting soil by trees that they knew Black folks were lynched. And it's like, how can we actually do the forensic botany and the forensic work of creating a soil archive? And they have like 500 like huge jars of soil that are placed under markers that say the date that this person was lynched. And this is now a new way of kind of paying respects and bearing and acknowledging these sites. So that is an example of kind of this forensic work of archiving through soil and plants. Another one that we see that's been very inspirational is the maritime archaeology of folks who have been actually studying sunken slave ships to better understand how 1 out of 10 slave ships that crossed the Atlantic actually sunk because of mutiny. You know, they didn't all just make it. Black folks actively chose death over those things, actively sinking them. So 1 out of 10, that leaves a lot of archival base. How can we understand how Black folks fought for their last autonomy and death, right? Through that type of work. Forensic botany. Cheers to my friend Sergio Beltran Garcia, who is creating a forensic architecture lab in UNAM, which is the main National University of Mexico. He does some of the most powerful work around forensic botany and forensic architecture. So Mexico, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but over 150,000 people have been disappeared in Mexico by organized crime in the state in the past 10 years. And what he does is he actually uses forensic botany and forensic architecture to help find the remains of people by studying how plants actually interact with disappeared body parts in the countryside. So that's another way that people actually actively using this type of like material witness. And that's what I'm really building on here is material witnesses. What materials can we use to help us remember? One of my favorite authors, an incredible dean, biologist, incredible person, Brenda Montgomery, has this beautiful book coming out the end of this year called When Trees Testify: 7 Species That Bear Witness to Black Botanical Legacy. And she's looking at both species of trees, but then also particular specimen. Like, how did a 300-year oak that's in the same land that my ancestors worked, like, how can I think about it breathing the same air as my ancestors? How could I think about it as experiencing some of the same conditions and some of the same soil as my ancestors, right? So that's a really powerful example that I try to hold on to. And there's a wide range of historians and archaeologists who study pre-colonial Africa through very similar types of plant material witness work. Oilseeds as method, these are some of the books that I mentioned. I mentioned Landscapes of Freedom by Claudia Leal, Palm Oil Diaspora. I have a fiction here by Gail Jones on that this is actually Palmares was a famous quilombo, or earlier Mark had mentioned the Maroons in Jamaica, and the quilombos were civil communities that were made by Black people who freed themselves and oftentimes made laws to protect themselves. Unfortunately, similar like in the case of Maroons, they also made agreements with colonial powers to actually capture, runaways as well. So it wasn't necessarily just this hoorah happy story of like these communities that protected themselves. There was layers to it. But and then lastly, Pilar Guerrera has these beautiful series of films that track Black populations in Ecuador through coconuts and mangroves. So why study the history of oil seeds in Guerrero, Mexico? I could get into like all these kind of academic narratives, but I'll just say it helps me understand histories of race, histories of violence, histories of environmental change, histories of capitalism, and then histories of technology and science, particularly the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is actually started in the Pacific coast of Mexico, not too far from the regions that I study, but most of the narratives around those focus on grains. But if you really do the research on it, you actually see the oil seeds were really fundamental in that history as well. So there's many reasons why I've kind of come to this. So now I'm going to zoom into the case study. Just make sure I'm good on time. Okay. I'm just going to zoom into the case study real quick so I can familiarize you with the state that I study. So Guerrero, this is on the Pacific coast of Mexico. If you know where Mexico City is, it's about 300 miles south. And Nueva España was a slave trading region in the 16th and 17th century, bringing over 200,000 displaced Africans from West Africa. So we don't necessarily always think of Mexico as having a robust, dynamic, invisible population of people of African descent, but 200,000 is only second behind the number of Black people who were forcibly displaced to first Brazil, then the United States, third Mexico. So Mexico had a huge, gigantic population of Afro-Mexicans, and this is the region that has the highest concentration today of people who self-identify as Afro-Mexico. So in communities of Cuajinicualapa, which had that picture, in San Marcos, I think 70% of people self-identify as Afro-Mexican, and something like 80% of people self-identify as Afro-Mexican in this region. But unfortunately, and I'll get into this in a little bit, there is no archival demarcation of being of African descent in Mexico for almost 200 years, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So the Spanish brought Africans to this corner of the colony, particularly for the first oilseed population. So if you go even further back, there's a pre-colonial history of oilseeds and power in this region. So the Amuzco, Tlaponec, and Nahua populations that lived in this region before the Spanish and forcibly displaced Africans came to this region, they actually had to pay tribute to the Aztec Empire through cacao. So even before there was Spanish colonialism, there was still imperial colonialism that had a network of transfer of oil seeds from one region to the next, right? So when the Spanish came, they're like, oh, this cacao, this is money right here. Let's build on this, all right? So they first used indigenous labor to build plantations, but then they brought in Africans to build that. But by the 17th and 18th century, that cacao had shifted to cotton. So this became one of the major producers of cotton in the region. And still up to the 1890s, it was the largest producer of cotton in all of Mexico, and one of the largest producers of cotton in all the Americas. But that started to shift in the 1890s when, so basically after the United States took over the Philippines after the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines was the largest producer of coconut and gave the United States this huge coconut industry to make all these things. Procter & Gamble across the street, not too bad, they were really into it, right? Because you make soap out of it, you can make all these things. Procter & Gamble was really into the Philippines for that reason. But that also encouraged other U.S. businessmen to try growing coconuts elsewhere. So in this region, U.S. businessmen purchased hundreds of thousands of acres to grow hundreds of thousands of coconuts. And very interestingly, one of the things that I do in my research is I show how Afro-Mexican communities after the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 said, we grew those coconuts. We've helped them mature the last 20 years. They didn't just randomly ask for any strip of land to start their agrarian reform. They asked particularly for the orchards that they had developed. So that's one of the ways that I track Afro-Mexican agrarian reform after the revolution is from this place. So this map, who was made by a good friend of mine and landscape architect, Elisa Diamond, this shows in the brown areas, that's just coconuts. In this color is just cotton. But most of them have cotton and sesame in these green areas. And these areas that are dark green have sesame and coconut. So it's ways to kind of show this, how oil seeds really kind of shape the coast, right? And And so this was also really important in terms of the independence movement in general. So I mentioned Vicente Guerrero, the person that was this state is named after. If it wasn't for oilseed Afro-Mexican farmers, the Mexican Revolution would not have been, the Mexican independence movement in 1810 would not have been as successful as it was when it was. So in 1810, the people who are now had created Mexico, they start an independence movement against Spain, like most of the now Latin American countries. But by 1816, all of the contingents across all of what becomes Mexico had failed. They had all lost to the Spanish except for one. There was one contingent that was able to hide in the hills and outlast the Spanish for 4 years and ultimately find victory. And that was Vicente Guerrero, and that was the Afro-Mexican indigenous cotton sharecroppers that he had mobilized in the region that I just showed you. And they were able in 1820 to finally make the agreements to establish Mexican independence. So there would be no Mexican independence as you know it, as it happened, if it wasn't for this history of oilseed crops in the Afro-Mexican population in this region. So this is one of the reasons why it's also it's actually a history that kind of is like Haiti. Like everyone in the Americas was really excited about Haitian independence, but then it became this fear that like, this black politics, what could happen about this, right? And one of the things that you see across Latin American independence movement is a lot of regions that were really important for military black power, which were central for fighting the Spanish. That was something that was really embraced during the independence movement. But once you had these new governments form, by the mid-1820s, they're like, that was really cool, you being unruly and everything and ungovernable. We loved that for fighting the Spanish. But while we're trying to build the nation state, that's really not what we want. So these regions were actively underdeveloped and actively marginalized to basically kind of curtail that black political region and black political strength. So this region, Guerrero, which is the only state in Mexico named after a president, then becomes kind of black marked literally as this place of black politics, black power, black control, black boxed, right? So this is one of the reasons why Guerrero is one of the most marginalized and one of the poorest regions in the Americas, particularly in Mexico. So I really pick up this narrative a little bit later in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, when I told you some of these US farmers and businessmen came to develop these soap industries. So this photo, which was taken by National Geographic in 1904, around the same time these big US companies started growing coconut plantations, they started with these soap factories. Ultimately, Procter & Gamble builds a factory in Acapulco, Nestle builds a factory in Acapulco, Anderson Clayton builds a factory in Acapulco. It becomes a really center of vegetable oil and soap production, but it really starts in this era. So this photo says these half Negro, half Indian women are collecting these palm nuts to take to the soap factory. And a lot of my research really focuses on, like after the revolution, how Afro-Mexican communities kind of take over that soap industry to make it their own. So that's really some of the most important parts of the research. So I want to go in a little nitty gritty just to talk a little bit about the archival, like how it's done. So the question I ask going in the archive is, in the case of the black diaspora in this region, can oilseeds serve as material witness to environmental justice and injustice? And oilseed as method, I follow these oilseeds in ejido records. So the ejidos are the collective units that are collective, basically land grant, collectively held farms that are established after the Mexican Revolution. There are 29,500 of them across Mexico, and they were established between 1920 and 1950 as one of the largest, if not the largest, agrarian farm in world history. So one of the narratives that comes out of Mexican history, and it's really predominant across Latin America, is that there wasn't really a black peasantry in the same way there was a mestizo peasantry or an Indian peasantry, and they didn't necessarily integrate into agrarian reform in the same way. But by following oilseeds in the archive, coconut, cotton, sesame, you really can see how active they were in reshaping this political movement. So I do most of my research in the Archivo General Agrario, which is the Agrarian Archive of Mexico, and then several military archives, as well as this is the major kind of agricultural archive, and then this is an archive of an engineer who actually from Germany, moved down to this region to help with fixing some of the soap factories and oil mills. And he left an archive. Unfortunately, the state of Guerrero and the kind of narrative of underdevelopment and having few resources does not have a state archive. It was closed by the state, and I'd be happy to answer questions on just the political state of Guerrero and the history of the violence a little bit, but I'm trying to get going. Plus, I want to tell you a little bit more about the broader history that really speaks to sesame, not just in Mexico, but also in the Americas. That'll really kind of address more of my reading. So sesame as archival witness. Sesame, like I said, is another oilseed that serves as a plant archive for building proxies and methods for justice by reading Black history into the landscape. People have grown sesame in semi-arid environments in Africa for millennia. It was also a critically important crop in the diaspora, as enslaved farmers grew it in their provision grounds for food, good luck, oil, and other things like illumination and lanterns to medicine. In the 20th century, hunters looking for wild occurring sesame seeds looked for wild occurring sesame seeds because it attracted doves and quails. What if sesame also brought good luck to provision grounds in the form of hunting birds? So that's one of the questions I actually asked some biochemists at LSU who reached out to me to help devise more historical questions to inform their biochemical analysis of Louisiana. And I will happy to help you track sesame or track sunflower and indigenous populations, but I think we should add sesame because I keep finding these records of hunters in the 1920s and 1930s looking for sesame. And if you ever look for bird seed, I promise you'll see sesame, and it's one of those things that really attracts birds. So it made me wonder, we've been talking about provision grounds, you know, and people of African descent oftentimes sprinkled sesame on the outside of their grounds because it kept intruders away. It was a spiritual thing. And I was wondering, well, one, deer hate it, rabbits hate it. So when they think, so it's interesting, they thought it kept intruders away. It really did, right? You know, and that's one of those things we oftentimes try to use science to validate, you know, indigenous and Black thought when it never needed validation. It really just stood on its own, right? But it made me wonder if another good form of good luck was it actually attracted birds to the plot, right? So that's one of the things I'm actively doing with scientists to actually move from method to proxy. Maybe I could do that as a historian. I don't know. But contrasting oilseeds with tree rings to suggest that oilseeds can serve as an archive for Black environmental experience in the tropics. However, there are limitations to this binary. Namely, I presented oilseeds as method rather than archive in the biochemical sense, right? However, my ongoing work with LSU biochemists and evolutionary biologists might lead to new findings that actually situate oilseeds as archive and proxy of Black botanical knowledge. If our grant is successful, who knows, I've had to give back $450,000 in the last 3 months. I will support their lab in LSU with questions, yeah, we don't need to get into that, from Black environmental historiography to help us trace Black seed keepers and breeders' impact to spread sunflowers and sesame, which in the US South was called Benny since the 1700s. With critical and historically informed interdisciplinary analysis, we hope to move oilseed as method toward an interpretation of oilseed as biophysical archives and proxies of Black environmental knowledge and practice. Thank you so much for listening to this part. I'm gonna go into my reading. Before I'm about to read parts of Sesame Plots, which just came out. It's called Diaspore and 21 Openings. It was inspired. Has anybody ever heard of Janet Malcolm used to write for New Yorker? Okay. So Janet Malcolm wrote this famous piece called 41 False Starts, where she was trying to introduce an artist, a painter, as he was retiring. And she was struggling with the narrative. She was struggling with the process. And basically, she kind of sat with the fact that, you know, storytelling is fragmented, artists are oftentimes fragmented, and the work of archival, picking up the pieces, is fragmented. So she tells it in 41 introductions to this painter. So in a very similar way, trying to mimic the fragmented nature of a plot, the fragmented nature of doing Black environmental history, the fragmented nature of trying to do our histories when they're silenced, you know, I decided to tell this history through 21 openings. Shout out to my editor, Clay Kanzler. He's incredible. Please, if you're interested, take up and read some of these other pieces, but I'm going to read some of Sesame Plots to finish. Okay. Sesame Plots, Diaspora and 21 Openings. And this is just kind of the first sentence. Then they start with 1, 2, 3. What do sesame seeds tell us about the environmental histories of the African diaspora? How does a historian know where to start? It's all a question of process. 1. Sesame seed pods look like the progeny of okra and edamame. They hang upright on thin stalks like fuzzy, elongated dreidels. Sometimes scholars wonder what first attracted humans to a particular plant, such as the cyanide-laced cassava. That's unnecessary with sesame pods. Their appeal is obvious. They look like they're holding something inside. If their boxiness doesn't catch people's attention, then the sound of them rattling when ripe surely will. Four, to save time and space, planters extended marginal time and marginal lands to their enslaved property. To burn daylight asking black folks about their dooryard gardens and plots would have defeated the planter's goal of extracting wealth from black life as cheaply as possible. Despite plant owners' efforts to ignore and discount the black lived experience, the historical record is no monolith. Try as they might to exclude us, we have black environmental history at our disposal. Black environmental analysis is nothing new, but we now read landscapes better than ever, highlighting and underlining power and racism like we might these sentences. We can take places we know existed, such as an enslaved person's dooryard garden, and analyze what Imani Morrison calls black spatial affordances. Since we know from many sources that black folks were allowed and even encouraged to grow sesame in their gardens, we can use the plant to trace numerous scenes of survival. One topographical sketch of Florida in 1821 noted black folks growing sesame to, quote unquote, afford luxurious repasts of cakes, pottage, and other compositions of sugar. Sesame, like okra and watermelon, was one of the few plants that people successfully transplanted from tropical West Africa to the more temperate climates of the U.S. South. Tropical dooryard gardens have climate affordances different from those of subtropical ones. You won't find tamarind, plantain, or oil palm growing in Mississippi. However, sesame found a way to the rice coasts of the Carolinas. Here, observers witnessed black folks planting, quote, their benny in the hills like beans, end quote. Benny is what our ancestors called it. To imagine how black folks planted sesame, it helps to consider geography, season, and even time of day. In South Carolina, planting was likely at night in the late spring, sometime after the rains, never before. The soil needed to be moist, but not too damp. Gardening by moonlight was demanding after a long day working other people's land. Imagining the strain on the eyes gives new meaning to planting by hand. Feeling through the soil, making knuckle-deep holes to place the seeds. Or maybe planting sesame required more faith than care. According to folklore, free black farmers sprinkled sesame seeds at the entrance of their cabin homes, just like their enslaved ancestors had. Six. My late Uncle Bernie Porter lived in Beaufort, South Carolina for decades before passing away in 2017. At his funeral, I remember seeing his widow, Shirley Porter, and meeting his stepdaughter, Natalie Dice. I also remember feeling starstruck because Natalie and her husband, Ron, starred in one of the most popular children's shows for black kids in the 1990s, Gullah Gullah Island. It was another Sesame Street for us, a place where exciting black things happened. And though the Nickelodeon show was mostly shot on set in Orlando, Florida, the landscape and exterior sequences showed Beaufort, a place with sesame streets, sesame people, and sesame culture. Only the Gullah and the Geechee, people of Beaufort area and the neighboring Sea Islands, pronounced their sesame Benny. They knew Benny as well as they knew the fish, turtles, and oysters teeming through their landscape. I can't remember which ones I wanted to read to y'all. 8. 8. The first people who wrote the word sesame carved it in stone as cuneiform. Hammurabi's code, the Akkadian shape that sounded like sesame, sa, mas, sa, mu, resembled wedges in clay made by a fine, feather-like utensil. These markings describe sesame as a legal tool or currency to settle debts and serve as collateral. More than 3,500 years later, in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, the Gullah and Geechee people used sesame as a legal measure to handle disputes. According to Dorothea Bedigan, the pioneering scholar of the African origins of sesame in the Americas, priests in the Sea Islands used sesame punitively. They would scatter a bag of corn on the ground for a wrongdoer to pick up grain by grain for a minor offense, a quarter of rice for a grave offense, and a bag of sesame for the worst crimes. We unfortunately know little about this practice. Gullah and Geechee's traditions were not fully etched in South Carolina's record books, which can make collecting and recounting this environmental history feel like picking up sesame from the floor. 9. White supremacy has many blind spots. When James Thatcher visited a plantation in Savannah, Georgia in 1810, he, quote, became acquainted with Benny, end quote. But the writer from Massachusetts, like the southern planters he visited, had a better view of how enslaved communities use Benny than how to grow it in patches and gardens accessible to them. Planters surveilled their captive labor and jotted down notes about how enslaved people made Benny oil, food, medicine, and illumination and lanterns. Several accounts witnessed how black folks boiled and mixed Benny into their rations of Indian corn, which forms a nourishing food, end quote. That's a quote, sorry. Sometimes white observers witnessed black folks roasting and infusing the seeds into water like coffee. In more detail, Thatcher also noticed that black folks, quote, parch seeds over the fire, boil them in broths, make them into puddings, and prepare them in various other methods, end quote. Most notably, he expressly acknowledged enslaved black folks for introducing this fixed oil into the, quote, secondary catalog of our national pharmacopoeia, end quote. But planters' curiosities had its limits. They rarely listened to black goals, were oblivious to black intentions, and seldom imagined black success. What they did see was colored and distorted by racism. Moreover, since black folks felt watched, they did what they could to go unnoticed. There's a quiet violence to using planters' observations to understand black enslaved life, a complicity in historical silencing. How can we move from watching black life to listening to black life? How do we do this when the historical record keepers focused on black people as property with economic value, not as people with feelings and knowledge and relations beyond the plantation? Black environmental history counters silencing by emphasizing ecology over economy. The study of home, oikos logos, reveals more about life and livelihoods than the management of home, oikos nomos. So that's the ecology comes from the study of home versus ecology, or ecology comes from the study of home versus economy, the management of it. Focusing on ecological relations in tandem with economic ones, we can take a humble plant, such as sesame, to add to our incomplete understanding of black life in diaspora. I have 2 more. 11. Thomas Jefferson had overseers to watch his slaves, but we know he watched them too. He watched them to learn a variety of things, especially black botanical knowledge. Jefferson's curiosity was more intellectual than many of the planters. He studied and imitated enslaved black folks. He wanted to know what they planted, how, and why they planted it. And few of their plants piqued his interest more than sesame. From Monticello's dooryard gardens, Jefferson learned he learned from the enslaved how to grow sesame annually in Virginia and was encouraged to purchase and even build 3 different sesame oil presses. Without any mention of black folks, however, he wrote in one letter that Sesame, quote, is among the most valuable acquisitions our country has ever made, end quote. And the final one I'll read today, 19. For at least 60 years, my Nana has cared for an heirloom cast iron plant that her mother originally received from her grandfather. Her mother, my great-grandmother Winona, nurtured this low-maintenance plant for decades to honor and remember her father, my great-great-grandfather. My Nana calls it her granddaddy's plant. She speaks to most of her plants, but when she walks past this one, she says, "Good morning, granddaddy's plant." Or more directly, "Good morning, granddaddy." And caring for this heirloom plant, she cares for herself. It gives her a sense of pride and comfort. It also gives her a sense of hope and faith, which is not historically uncommon for black gardeners across the diaspora. My Nana does not remember any Benny seed on the family land or in her garden. Her brother, my Uncle Lefty, does not recall growing any either. He never saw his parents or uncles or grandparents growing anything resembling sesame. Perhaps our family land in Snow Hill, Maryland was too far north for sesame to grow well. Their sister, my Aunt Shirley, considered these geographic limits of sesame, but also vaguely remembers growing a, quote, Asian plant for good luck in her gardens in Northwest Philadelphia. Did she grow Benny for good luck, or did she grow something else? Whatever the answer, she nurtured a botany of faith, much like her sister, my Nana, and the black folks who have been growing sesame for millennia. Thank you.
Jayson, thank you so much.
Of course. Did you like the creative nonfiction?
I loved it,
Okay.
yes. I mean, I want to ponder over nearly every sentence you said.
Well, I
So
appreciate it.